They are not, by any measure, by landmass, by population, or by natural resources, a significant place to be in East Asia, and yet they are the only Eastern Asian country that is part of the group of sevens, that is part of the group of democratic industrial powers. I am talking, of course, about Japan. Welcome back to Streamlined Insights, a measure of the world that is both international and scientific. I'm Streamlined Engine. Now, there is a lot to talk about Japan. You can talk about its excellent preservation of historical and cultural sites. You can talk about its stunning natural environments. You can talk about how it transformed from a feudal society only in 1860 to 1894, in 30 years to an industrial country. You can talk about animation. You can talk about drama. But today, because we are here at Streamlined Insights, we are going to be focusing on semiconductors. Now, Japan and semiconductors has a very interesting love and hate history, which I won't have the time to go perfectly in depth into. If you want to know more about Japan's complete history, where Akio Morita first invented and commercialized semiconductor chips to be put into home electrons, check out Chip War by Chris Miller. This is like the third time I'm recommending this book. Really good. But we will be giving you a very, very brief overview of how Japan works with semiconductors and how Japan's rise and fall as a nation has just about everything to do with semiconductors after World War II. So, in the 1980s, at the height of their power, Japanese corporations, companies registered in Japan, they have a total of 40% of the market share in the global manufacturing of semiconductors. This is talking about the midstream. If you remember, we talked about upstream, midstream, and downstream in a few episodes prior. Anyway, they have 40% of the market share midstream. What about the United States, the primary economy in the world? The United States had a 33% market share at the time, 7% behind Japan. This is astounding. And what is rather, shall we say, what is rather shameful and what is rather a pity is that Japan did not let their strength, their newfound strength in semiconductors, go unnoticed within themselves. In 1985, they have a very infamous publication called No Doyeru Nihon. It's called The Japan That Can Say No. It's penned by Ishihara and, you guessed it, Morita of Sony. And it talked about how Japan should use its newfound strength in the semiconductor industry to challenge the United States-led international order, to rewrite the military order, and to erase the shame that is imposed upon the Japanese nation by the defeat in the Pacific War. Well, the United States, who is already facing a lot of pressure from domestic companies like Intel, Qualcomm, GlobalFoundries, Broadcom, to do something about the fierce Japanese competition that's been placed upon their production, and who is already rather concerned that most of the semiconductor chips used in weaponry is being produced in Japan and not in the US at that moment, is now thoroughly alarmed by the Japanese rhetoric. So they set forth to negotiate several deals with Japan. The thing with Japan is imperialist rhetoric can only go so far, because after World War II, Japan is a treaty-bound ally of the United States and who is constitutionally bound not to have a military. And so, couple that with the fact that Japanese corporations and negotiators are pretty comfortable in the domestic political environment of not having to fight too much with the government, of having very good relation with the government and getting the government to do whatever, pretty much whatever they need, is not at all used to the tough negotiation tactics, the tough legal tactics of the United States, which is why in 1985 and in 1986, the Plaza Accord, which effectively set the exchange rate of the Japanese yen and the United States dollar at a rather high rate to prevent the Japanese dumping cheap exports into the US market, and the 1986 US-Japan Semiconductors Agreement, which further set an export quota for Japan into the US at a limited amount, so was not again not to dump anything into it. Japan's semiconductor dominance is at an end. However, Japan did not realize this at the time. Japan thinks that with a powerful Japanese yen, the economy is going better than ever, and the prosperity of the nation of Japan will see no end. Well, that end came in 1990, when the financial crisis occurred and the housing market came crashing down. And after that, Japan entered a 30-year of deflation, 30 years of stagnation, when literally all other industrial countries in the world are battling inflation. It's true. Japan, with a mix of national hubris in imperial pride, with corporate hubris in not having to compete with the international market and with international regulations, and with a miscalculation of the political situation, brought themselves from the height of economic and technological powerhouse all the way down to deflation for 3 decades. Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that, because you have to couple that with the fact that in the 1990s, it witnessed the rise of Taiwan's TSMC, South Korea's Samsung, and just the rise of China as a whole. However, those 3 points are basically the main reason why Japan has stagnated for this long. Well, fast forward to 2023 and 2022, a year before that, and the political landscape is very different. In the 1980s, the US is terrified that Japan, with their newfound economic strength and with their imperial rhetoric, will set out to rewrite the order in East Asia. But now, in 2020s, the US is not afraid of Japan anymore. The US is afraid of someone else completely: China. Nowadays, it is China that is militarily saber-rattling. With their economic strength, they want to challenge the status quo. And with China, the US has a much more profound reason to be alarmed than when they were facing the Japanese. Because, well, fun fact, China is not a treaty-bound ally of Japan. Plus, China isn't constitutionally bound to limit their military. So, the US set out to impose sanctions on the Chinese semiconductor industry. They slapped export quotas, they slapped investment limitations, they slapped technological export limitations, they slapped all kinds of things on China, all the way from the Trump administration onto Biden administration. And throughout all of this, throughout this trade dispute over chips, Japan found itself firmly on the US allied side. The US isn't doing this alone. The US had ganged up its friends like Britain, Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, and of course Japan in its efforts to try to limit China. So, with itself firmly on the side of the US now, Japan, under leadership of Premier Kishida Fumio, saw an opportunity to jump back into the semiconductor field and regain wealth and relevance for Japan. And how are they going to do that? By launching a $100 billion corporation called Rapidus Corporation. Rapidus Yusukaisha in Japanese. So, what is Rapidus exactly? Well, Rapidus, as I just said, is a government project that is aimed to produce chips, just like TSMC, just like Samsung. And they are backed by 8 of the biggest tech tycoons in Japan. You name them: Toyota, NTT, Mitsubishi, Sony, and so forth. Their goal is to mass produce 2nm chips by 2025 and 1nm chips by 2027. Japan aims to carve out a place for itself in the midstream of the chips industry, just as it did before they were brought down by the 1985 Plaza Accords, the 1986 Semiconductors Agreement, and the 1990 financial crisis brought on by the crashing of the housing market. Japan wants to reclaim its old throne. And Japan thinks it is pretty well poised to do that, because for all the decline of Japanese chips industry, Japan still manufactures most of the machinery that you would need to produce semiconductors. Like I mentioned before, Tokyo Electrons, Nikon, and Canon produces the depository systems, the cleaning systems, and the transitory systems, everything you need in the production of semiconductors. So, plus that, with the fact that it is now an internationally agreed thing that Japan is allowed to develop its semiconductors in the context of US-China rivalry and context in Eastern Asia and the entire world, Japan thinks they have a pretty good chance. So, do they? Well, to answer that, we'll have to talk about Rapidus itself. Rapidus, from its founding in August 2022, has received the backing of the government and 8 corporations. And when I say backing, it doesn't just mean political backing, it means financial backing. Rapidus has already gotten $300 billion of subsidies from the Japanese government, and they don't have to pay any taxes until they enter mass production, which is a very great deal from the part of the government. And then Sony, NTNT, Toyota, Mitsubishi, they all ganged up to give Rapidus 70 billion% more $. So you would think that in terms of capital, Rapidus will be swimming in it, right? Well, you will be wrong. In fact, capital is just about the thing that is going to most likely be the derailing factor of Rapidus, because for its very ambitious goal that it set itself, to mass-produce 2 nanometers in 2025 and 1 nanometer in 2027, you need a lot, and I mean a lot, more than $370 billion. Rapidus plans to set up a plant in Chitose City. It's up in Hokkaido. And it plans to set up a city in Shongbun. This is in direct rivalry with TSMC. So they are going to need trillions of $. To do that. They don't nearly have enough. And they're actually having quite a lot of trouble finding capital investment aside from the Japanese government and aside from corporations in Japan. So if Rapidus wants to get producing before getting ground to a halt due to capital limitations, they will have to think of something fast. So, aside from capital, what about the political side of things? I mean, as I just said, Rapidus was already set up by the Japanese government, right? The Japanese government uses the model of state capitalism that it has practiced for decades upon decades now to help Rapidus get a footing. And of course, they have the international situation of Japan being on the allied side in the US and China rivalry. So you would think that Rapidus is pretty well poised in the political side of things, right? Well, in the domestic sector, yes. In state capitalism, which instinctively is not communism. Don't think of that. Communism means a state centrally allocating resources, distributing them, and setting up minute details, micromanaging every sector, every industry of society. Whereas state capitalism is not that. State capitalism allows for private enterprises. What the government do is to set up a goal or set up a plan to meet for industries to meet. And for those industries that actually met these goals, the government offers decreased taxes, government subsidiaries, infrastructure construction, training of workers, and a lot more. So essentially, it's the government helping these big corporations instead of taking charge of all of them. Japan has run this model successfully back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, all the way up to the 80s to recover from the ruins of World War II to the economic powerhouse before they were brought down in the Plaza Accord of 1985. And this model was successfully replicated by South Korea and Taiwan, Hong Kong, and later China itself as well. So, state capitalism, despite all that, despite all those hurdles, is still alive and well in Japan. And Kishida is not shy about planning to use that model again. And when it comes to the Japanese, it will work. So, there will be virtually no barrier within Japan for Rapidus to cooperate with other businesses, to cooperate with banks, and to cooperate with governments. What about on the international stage? It turns out things are not that simple. It's not just that, because the US and China are in contest, Japan is on the US side, so everyone allied with the US will give Japan what it wants. It's not as simple as that. Because you have to remember, this is an industry. Profit matters. Intellectual property matters as well. So, despite the fact that the Dutch company ASML is going to provide Rapidus with the EUV lithography machines that it had previously only ever given to TSMC, and despite the fact that Belgium Microelectronics Institute is allowing Rapidus engineers to go over there and train with them, and despite the fact that IBM has already provided Rapidus with tons of packaging technology that originally it had exclusive right over, despite all of that, it's not a smooth sail. In the case with IBM, GlobalFoundries has quite the issue of IBM having such a close cooperation with Rapidus. There's a lawsuit going on here. GlobalFoundries claims that IBM has illegally, against intellectual property law, given intellectual property rights that originally was shared by IBM and GlobalFoundries to Rapidus without the exclusive agreement of GlobalFoundries. So they are now filing a lawsuit for damage and for IBM to stop sharing technology with Rapidus. IBM denies all of this. IBM denies that the intellectual property was shared with GlobalFoundries and maintains that it is completely IBM's, and so it has the exclusive right to share it with anyone they likes. But as I said, the lawsuit is still going on. And if the lawsuit did not win in Rapidus and IBM's favor, then Rapidus will run into a big problem of not having the technology it needed. When it comes to track record, Japan has not been the best when it comes to international agreements. Well, in the 1940s, they famously started the entire Pacific War because they cannot agree with the international order. And then in the 1980s, they failed miserably in the Plaza Accords and the Semiconductors Agreement for failing to realize what that might mean for their country. So, nowadays, if Japan, with the project of Rapidus, wants to avoid that mistake of not understanding international politics, they are going to have to work hard. So that's the capital and political side of things, and the technology side of things. Finally, we have to talk about humans. Human capital. Just as important as capital, and just as important as hard technology when it comes to the chips industry. Because without talented engineers, you can't manufacture anything, even if you have the best equipment, and even if you have all the best materials. So, where's Rapidus going to find all these talented and well-trained engineers? Well, they thought they're going to find it all in Japan. But the problem is, with the chips industry stagnant for so many years, 30 years in fact, most of Japan's well-trained chip industry experts and well-trained engineers have moved abroad. They've either moved to TSMC, or they have moved to Samsung, or they've moved to China. So, if Japan wants to bring these people back, they need to offer good incentives. Plus, Rapidus has set itself a goal for having 500 employees in 2025 and 2,200 employees by 2027. You add that into the mix of Japan's declining birth rate, declining population, and you add in the mix of TSMC setting up a factory over in Xiongben, then it's going to be a very, very harsh competition between Rapidus and TSMC to fight for the best engineers. Rapidus doesn't acknowledge that they are trying to compete with the TSMC for anything. They say that their business model is completely different. But the truth of the matter is, if Rapidus wants to carve out a share in the midstream, they are going to be direct competition with both TSMC and Samsung. So, how are they going to do that? We'll just have to wait and see. Japan has not been a stranger to big gambles throughout its history. Japan gambled big to change itself from a feudal society in 1866 all the way up to the imperial power by the 1880s. Japan went to war with China and Russia in 1894 and 1904, gambling very big. Japan went to war with the US in the 1940s, gambling very big. So now Japan is going to reignite that gambling spirit within themselves and to start Rapidus Corporation. But if you put that into an analysis of good old-fashioned SWOT, strength, weakness, opportunity, and threat, the strength that Rapidus currently has in technology and domestic political support is great, yes, but it faces weakness in international politics and in finding the enough amount of capital. It has an opportunity because the international situation is very favorable to them at the moment, what with the US and China battling it out, figuratively, I mean. But they are also facing the threat of not being able to negotiate well enough in that context. So, you think about that. Rapidus has big dreams for itself. If it succeeds, it's going to mean wealth and relevance for Japan that it has not seen since the 1980s. As I said, when a country develops a successful chips industry, not only does it become wealthy, everyone has a job in the country for starters, but it becomes very important on the international stage as well. Just think of all those Western European countries whose industrial minds are far behind them, but who are still relevant these days because of chips. Japan wants that wealth. Japan wants that relevance. Are they going to get it? We will have to wait and see. If you want to know more about how exactly Japan transformed itself from feudal society all the way into imperial power in less than 30 years, sound off in the comments down below. If you want to know more about Japan's chip industry history, just by itself, check out Chip War by Chris Miller. He dedicated more than half of his book to talk about that. Next on, we will be talking about Germany and how it found itself tightly in bed with authoritarian powers. I am Streamlined Engine, and you have been listening to Streamlined Insights.